because I know you guys want to be on task and get things done, but we're not quite ready for it yet. But I just wanted to try to avoid the passing out thing. Yeah. So, before we spend a whole lot of time on that sheet, ignore the sheet that you have in front of you. The intent of it was just so we didn't have to pass it out later. What questions can we answer about chromosome anomalies? Anomalies is this idea that there's extra or missing, and it comes from non-disjunction that occurs in meiosis.
Is it possible that I have, like 2x, 2y, or double y
Yes,
and an x?
yeah, so what we showed you is just a few of the anomalies possible. So we had talked about like trisomy 21, trisomy 13, XXY. XXY is Klinefelter syndrome. Are there other varieties of those non-disjunctions with anomalies? The answer is absolutely yes. These are just a few of them. Is it possible to get an XXYY? Sure. Is it possible to get an XXX? Yes. Is it possible to get XXY? I think I already said that. XXYY. Sure. Okay. So there's lots of different anomalies that can occur, and it really depends upon what non-disjunction occurs on what individual. Now, in order to get like 4 of something, typically what that would mean is there was non-disjunction on the male and the female, and non-disjunction isn't super common to begin with. Could it happen? Sure. Now, will that individual, let's say we're talking humans, will that individually actually be born? I don't know. It's possible that the answer to that is no. It's possible that the answer to that is yes. It depends upon what the things are, and it also depends upon the body itself. So for example, trisomy 13, I think it was one of the patients that you went through yesterday. What was one of the things that when you looked up symptoms, and maybe you haven't gotten there quite yet, but what's trisomy 13? What's one of the symptoms or characteristics of someone with trisomy 13?
Small head or something.
Was it small head? I'll be honest, I didn't read that part.
Yeah.
Okay? But how long is the life expectancy?
I was gonna say another syndrome. Wasn't that like, Kleiner?
Oh, we're not talking about those. We're talking about trisomy 13. Okay, and I don't remember, and I'll be honest, I didn't do a whole lot of research, but I think the life expectancy of trisomy 13 is really short, right? I don't think they live very long. So even if the baby is born, they might not live to full term, or not full term, because full term would mean born, but might not live long after birth. Okay, so some of these anomalies are pretty significant. Okay, some of these you might not know. Some of these, it's possible that one of us in the room has these. It's possible. Okay, and we just might not know. Hang on here. So, when we talk about these anomalies, they can be on the sex chromosomes, like XXY, Klinefelter syndrome, or they could be on the autosomes. And remember, autosomes are chromosome number 1 through 22 of our pairs. So, the idea that we want to make sure that we're clear on is what an autosome is and a sex chromosome is. So our autosomes are 1 through 22, and our sex chromosomes are either XX or XY. The X chromosomes are bigger than the Y chromosomes. When we draw a Y chromosome, some people like to go like that. That's not actually what a Y chromosome looks like. It still has the X shape, it's just much, much, much smaller. So I think it was on that first individual on the online karyotype. I would agree that the 2 sex chromosomes were not the same size, but they were pretty close. So I would consider those to be an XX combination because they're about the same size. Okay, so sex chromosomes are pair number 23, but autosomes are 21 through 22. Now the reason we're bringing this up is because we're going to go through a couple progressions here of like modes of inheritance. So most of what we've talked about so far are what we would consider to be autosomal characteristics. They're things that are carried on the autosomes, on chromosome number 1 through 22. Now we could go through, and if we were to talk about pea plants, if we were to have big T being for a tall pea plant, and little t being for a short pea plant. Now, we're talking about pea plants, but we could talk about that those are carried on the autosomes. Those are characteristics that are carried on chromosomes 1 through 22 if they were a human. I don't know how many chromosomes a pea plant has. Okay, but the idea is we could look at these and they are not connected to the sex chromosomes. Now there's two different types of autosome traits we can look at. There's something called autosomal dominant traits, and there's something called autosomal recessive traits. Okay, now we hopefully remember what a dominant trait is versus a recessive trait. A dominant trait is something that we see if a dominant allele is there. If there is a dominant allele, we see that dominant allele. Okay? If it's a recessive trait, the only time we see the recessive trait is when there isn't a dominant allele. I got thinking about this. So we have two modes of inheritance. We call them autosomal dominant traits and autosomal recessive traits. I feel like, and maybe I'm completely wrong, that we could talk about pea plants being autosomal dominant trait or an autosomal recessive trait, and it's kind of the perspective that you look at it. If we were looking at the short plant characteristic in a pea plant, then we would, in my mind at least this works, that we could call it an autosomal recessive trait. Because the trait we are looking at is the recessive trait. So we could say height in plants is autosomal recessive. We could. Now most of the time we would talk about it being an autosomal dominant trait, because we'd be talking about is the tall trait the dominant trait or not. So I feel like it's somewhat perspective or relative to how we look at it. But most of the time when we look at these characteristics, we're not looking at tall versus short, we're looking at something along the lines of, does an individual have a certain disease or trait or characteristic? Okay, so do they have Huntington's disease? Do they have colorblindness? That's a bad example because that's sexual. Do they have some type of disease or disorder or some type of symptoms? Okay, so what we really could look at is whether it's dominant or recessive traits. So this idea of autosomal dominant trait means if it's carried on chromosomes 1 through 22, and if they have a dominant allele, they have that trait or they have that characteristic or whatever the heck we're looking at. Okay? If, however, it's autosomal recessive, the only time the person will have that characteristic is if they're homozygous recessive. They have to be homozygous recessive. Okay? This idea is something that we can then kind of carry over into sex chromosomes. So sex chromosomes, so autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, those are characteristics that we're going to look at and we're going to trace through family lineages. Okay, we call them pedigrees. We're going to do that next week probably. We're going to look at those and how we can trace those throughout. We're also going to look at these things called sex-linked traits. Now, there's different types of sex-linked traits, but the type of sex-linked trait that we're going to focus on is referred to as a sex-linked recessive trait. So the idea is you have to have you can't have a dominant allele in order to see the recessive trait, right? The only time we see the recessive trait is in the absence of a dominant trait. The difference is it's carried on the sex chromosome. Now the ones that we're going to talk about are carried on the X chromosome, but it's not unheard of that there are sex-linked traits that are carried on the Y chromosome, and only the Y chromosome. So there are some, the ones we tend to focus on are not X-linked. I'm sorry, they're not Y-linked, they tend to be X-linked. So two of the most common two of the most sex-linked recessive traits that we tend to talk about is colorblindness and hemophilia. Those are kind of the classic examples that we use when we talk about sex-linked recessive traits. So, just quick show of hands. I'd like you to raise your hand and keep it up if you know someone who's colorblind. Raise your hand if you know someone who's colorblind. Okay, look around the room, there's a fair amount, okay? Now, keep your hand up okay, everyone look around, put your hand up again if you know someone who's colorblind. Okay, see how many hands are up. Okay, good. Look around the room. Now, keep your hand up if one of the people you know who are colorblind is a female. And I see one. Okay, I see one of those hands that were originally, thank you, were female. So that kind of leads us to this idea that, this sex-linked trait happens more frequently in males based upon a quick survey of hands, right? So colorblindness is this kind of classic example. So the first thing I want you to do, we're going to talk about colorblindness, and I want you to go through, and I want you to take a colorblind test. Now, most of you will probably do fine on this. Some of you might already know you're colorblind, some of you, whatever. I'm not asking you about your personal information. But this is where our electronic devices are going to get used, because we're going to Google Enchroma color test, okay? Or you can just Google Enchroma, and you'll get to their homepage, and then at the bottom of that, there is a thing that says Start Test. I'll show you really quick on the screen what that looks like. But I want you to it's a pretty quick thing to do. So if you just go to Enchroma's website, so if you simply typed Enchroma, Google Enchroma and Chrome, oops, I didn't want glasses. You just go to Enchroma, if you Google that, Enchroma is a company, just for the record, and you can either go to their homepage, or you can go to the bottom, and as you scroll down, you would get $20 off your order. There is test your color vision and start the test. Okay, so go ahead and do it. It's a pretty quick thing, and you click Start Test again. And the idea is there's a number in your iPad or your phone. If you do not have your school-issued iPad, now is the time you can use your phone. But we'll be putting them away here in a little bit. I took too long to answer this. But there's a number. They're called a Rorsch test. Rorsch, I don't know. It's a colorblind test is what it's called. There's some name for it. Okay, and there's a bunch of colored pixels, and then you go through and you type what number it is, or if there's nothing there or unsure. Okay, I don't know how many slides. It's a pretty quick thing. Go ahead and do it.
There's like
Spelled
25.
And thing. Okay, now is where you use your electronic device. Take this color vision test. Yeah.
So that movement back there.
I was counting how many there were, but I didn't.
Can't see that one, bro.
You do not have to enter your email address, by the way.
Click down, no thanks.
No thanks. Continue to test results.
Can't read that one.
To wrap that up, there's a series of questions. I don't know exactly what. And as you've gone to the eye doctor throughout your life, assuming you've been to the eye doctor throughout your life, this is a pretty common pre-screen thing, right? Before you actually see the optometrist, they go through and they check for different things. They give you that wonderful puff of air in the eye. They take that picture, which blinds you to, no, that's the real one afterwards. They dilate your pupils sometimes, but they do these tests, okay? And the intent of this is to kind of catch it. Now, most of the time, if you were going to be colorblind, you probably would have found out pretty quick. Because this is something that doesn't tend to change over time. Are there things that could happen in your life that then trigger something? It could, but it probably wouldn't be because it's an inherited trait at that point, because of color vision. Could be, doesn't have to. You know, color blindness tends to be like where one of your, I don't remember if it's cones or rods in your eyes doesn't detect light properly. Okay? So it doesn't recognize some of it. So could like an eye injury potentially cause something like that? Yeah, it could. And I found this, so Enchroma, again, this is a company I said. Enchroma is a company that has a pair of glasses that you could buy. And depending upon, there's different types of color blindness. Okay, there's different types of color blindness. The most common kind of color blindness is something called red-green. So, but this is again their website. Is like, again, I mean, my colors are kind of skewed on the screen, but if this is what normal vision, this would work, you grab that light. If this is what people with normal color vision have, they see the reds, they see the greens, they see the browns. But if you were, and I don't remember what all these different types of color blindness is, the reds kind of look more brownish, or look greenish, okay? There's a different type of color blindness, and then there is a type of color blindness where you see like no colors at all. Okay, so depending upon what type of color blindness it is, this company sells a pair of glasses that you can put on and it will actually correct. You can see the colors that you typically can't see. I think it's specific red-green, but I'm not sure about that. But that's the most common type of color blindness, is red-green color blindness. So there's videos out there that you may or may not have seen. There's some on their website, their testimonials of like these people who put these glasses on for the first time ever, and they see reds that they've never seen before. You know, so there's lots of different images that you can look at of what colorblind people would see versus not. You know, it's like rows of tulips that are red, and they kind of see like a grayish, greenish color. Okay, so that's kind of colorblind. It's a sex-linked recessive trait. It's carried on the X chromosome, and only the X chromosome. Okay, so it's a recessive trait. The only time we see a recessive trait is when there isn't a dominant allele. And it's only on the X chromosome. Okay? So that's why we spent some time talking about X and Y chromosomes, because we can do Punnett squares with X chromosomes and Y chromosomes. And we went through and we said, hey, look at that, 50% of the time we get XX and 50% of the time we get XY. The only difference with a sex-linked recessive Punnett square is we add some subscripts to the X's that we carry across, okay? But it's still this idea. So when we talk about these sex-linked recessive traits, that's what we're going to be looking at, okay? So let's take a look at that sheet that you picked up on the way in. There's two sides to this. This is something we're going to work on together, and we're going to discuss. I saw some of you were kind of working on it already. Which is fine, but we're going to kind of work through this and kind of talk about it. So, when, yeah.
It says the most common one is red-green, but
Yep.
next is blue-yellow color blindness.
Okay. So, when we go through, Mr. Moore, I think you got to turn it. Okay. So, sex-linked is probably one of the most, one of the most common examples. Mr. DeGrand shared with me a TED Talk, I think it was a TED Talk, maybe it wasn't a TED Talk, I remember, that there are some examples where two identical female twins, one was colorblind, one wasn't. He said something about how we as humans can actually turn off one of the X chromosomes, and specifically it'd be one of the X chromosomes if you were a female, okay, but I haven't watched it yet. So, colorblindness is a trait that's carried on the sex chromosome. Specifically, it's carried on the X chromosome. So if we symbolize X big B for the allele that has normal color vision, okay, so X big B, the big B represents the dominant allele. So X big B symbolizes the allele for normal color vision, and X little b symbolizes the allele for red-green color blindness. So we're saying X little b is the recessive allele for color blindness. Okay, so these alleles are carried only on the X chromosomes for humans. So this is really quick, just a quick review of biological sex. XX tells us that that is a
Female.
okay, that's a female. The letter B's don't influence male versus female.
Colorblind.
Okay. X big B, X little b is male or female?
Female.
It's female, XX, right? If there's a Y, it's a guy. That's kind of the way I remember I said. So XY, if there's a Y, it's a guy, so that's a male. The next one's a,
Got it.
yep, and then the last one is a,
Female.
okay, so we have lots of different possible genotypes, right? These are still genotypes of genetic letters, and this tells us the biological gender of these individuals. The B's are the alleles for color blindness or normal vision. So of the 3 females and 2 male combinations, these are all the possible allele combinations that we can have for color vision, just for the record. Okay, color blindness. This is all the letter B combinations that we can have. So there's 5 different combinations. Is color blindness a dominant trait or a recessive trait?
Dominant trait.
It's recessive. It's a recessive trait. It says red-green color blindness is a little b. The only time we see the little b, which is carried on the X, is when there is no big B. Okay? The dominant big B covers the little b. So what do we see here? The big B or the little big B or the big B? Big B, right? What do we see here? The big B or the little b?
Big B.
The big B. What do we see here?
Big B.
There is only a B, but it's a big one. Okay? What do we see here?
Same thing.
There's a typo on this, isn't there, Wizard War? One of these has got to be different. That's got to be a little. Hey everyone, typo, edit. Make that a X little b y. That should be X little b y. Because otherwise these are the exact same genotype. This is X little b y. Okay? So we're going to make that X little b y. And then, so if this is X little by, what do we see? The big B or the little b? The little b, because there isn't a big B to cover up the little b. And what do we see here?
Little B.
The little b. Now the only time we're colorblind is when we see the little b and only the little b. So of these 5 possible outcomes, genotypes, which ones are colorblind? Is this, well, let's just go through. Normal or colorblind?
Normal.
What about this one?
Normal.
What about this one?
Normal.
Normal, right? Because they have a big B, they're all dominant to cover up the recessive allele, if there isn't a recessive allele. But we're seeing the dominant big B. What about this one? Normal or colorblind?
Colorblind.
This is colorblind. What about this one?
Colorblind.
Colorblind. Now, in order for a female to be colorblind, how many X little b's does she have to have?
2.
She has to have 2. Where did this one come from? Okay, this one came from mom. And if this one came from mom, where did this one come from?
Dad.
So they had to get a allele, an X little b, from both mom and dad. However, this is a male. How many X little b's do they need?
1.
They need 1. Where did this X come from? Are you sure it didn't come from dad? How do we know this didn't come from dad? Because where did this come from?
Dad.
Because dad's the only one that had the Y, right? So that one had to come from mom. Just so we're clear. So which exhibit color blindness? Okay, this one and this one. These 2, is that what we're going? These 2 are colorblind, right? Is that what we're going with, Mr. Moore? Okay, gotcha. There's an arrow. Okay, so those 2 are the ones that are colorblind. X little b Y and X little b X little b. Those are colorblind individuals. One's male, one's female.
So how many are normal?
3.
3, and it's the first 3, right? If there's a big B, it covers any little b's that exist. Now, of the first 3, only one of them had a little b, the second one. Well, do we see that X little b? No. Why? Because there was an X big B that covered the X little b. Okay? So, which has normal vision even though they have a colorblind allele? Yeah.
X big B, X little b.
Yeah, X big B, X little b. They are carrying the colorblind allele, but they don't have colorblindness, right? They are not colorblind because they have an X big B and that big B is covering the little b. What gender is that individual?
Female.
That's a female. Now, does this female have colorblindness?
Oh.
No, right? She does not have colorblind. But is she carrying an allele for colorblindness.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm emphasizing that word. We call her, and it doesn't have to be sex-linked, any individual that carries a trait on but doesn't have the trait is referred to as a carrier for that trait. Okay? She's what we call a carrier. Now, if we were to look at a different trait, it could be like, I'm making letters up, it could be big T, little t. If it's a dominant trait that we're looking at, this is the recessive. This person would also be considered a carrier for the little t characteristic because they don't have the big T showing, but they are carrying that allele. And the idea is they could carry it on to the next generation, or they could pass it on to the next generation. That's what a carrier means. They don't have the trait, but they can carry it on. Now, if we take a quick look up here, let's look specifically at the males. Are there any males that we could consider to be carriers? Are there any males that don't have color blindness, but they could pass it on to the next generation? No, right? There aren't. Because the B's are only on the X chromosomes. They either have color blindness or they don't have color blindness. There's only one XB, so they either have it or they don't. There's no carrying it. Carriers for sex-linked have to be females and can only be females. So Punnett Squares are really the exact same thing that we've done before, like we did with sex chromosomes, except for we've put a B next to it. Okay, so we go through and we put uppercase B next to the X chromosomes and the X chromosomes only. So we did the first one for you. It's drag and drop. The idea is we bring the rows over, we bring the columns down, because when we write sex chromosomes, we go X before the Y. We always put the X first, go XY. By convention, we always put the big B before the little b if it's a heterozygous. This is called heterozygous, this is homozygous, because they're same versus different. Okay, so same thing here. This is going to be an XX, right? Because there's an X chromosome, X chromosome. So I like to start with the sex chromosomes. Then what's the B letter that's going to go first? Big B or little b? Big B, and what's going to go next?
Little b.
Little b, because we bring the big B over, down the little b over. This is X, X, and this is going to be X,
Little b.
well, X little b, and this is going to be X,
Little b.
little b. We go X, Y, and this is going to be X, big B. What goes on the Y? Nothing. Nothing goes on the Y. Okay? And then this is going to be X, Y, and it's going to be X, little b. That's the format that we kind of follow in this process. So, we'll give you a couple minutes. Yeah, I think so. So we'll give you a couple minutes. We want you to finish these Punnett squares. And then there's some coloring and some shading that we're going to ask you to do, which is kind of slightly ironic that we're using red and green to color the ones that are colorblind, and that's the most common version of colorblindness is red and green colorblind. But we're going to ask you to go through and do some shading, so blue, yellow, red, and green, to kind of go through, and it'll help us kind of visualize and look at what's most common. So if you're new to my, all right, so
I did one wrong.
we are coloring in the parents right now, which is something that you were not asked to do. And the reason, I think so. So we went through and only colored in for after the first two. We only did the parents. Never mind, we're going to get them all. Okay, so if we were to specifically look at reds and greens, okay, because reds and greens are the individuals that are colorblind, statistically are going to be colorblind. Okay, so colorblind males, colorblind male, colorblind male, colorblind male, female, female. Of all the reds and greens or of all the colors, green occurs more often than the reds, between the reds and the greens, right? So red and green are the colorblind individuals, but there's more greens than there are reds. And the reason, so Mr. DeBoer went through and he color-coded the parents with reds and greens, because again, those are the individuals that have color blindness. So in order for a male to be colorblind, they get a X little b, and they only need one X little b. But it's possible for that X little b to come from a mom who does not have the trait. So mom here is a carrier. I'm sorry, I pointed to the female. The son here gets the X little b from mom who had normal vision. Mom was a carrier for it. Okay? In order for a female to be colorblind, so anytime we see some red boxes, what was their dad? What was her dad? Colorblind or not colorblind? Has to be colorblind, right? So the idea is it's less common for a female to be colorblind because she has to get two X little b's, If mom is colorblind and dad is colorblind, guess what all of their kids are going to be? Lower right corner, they're all going to be colorblind. Okay? In order for a female to be colorblind, they would have to have a colorblind dad. They would have to have a colorblind dad because daughter gets two X's, one from mom, one from dad, and the only X chromosome that dad has is an X little b. Okay? So looking through this, what was that question? Do more males or female have colorblind? Male. And it's really, and the reason for this is because they have to get only one recessive allele. They only have to get one recessive X allele. Whereas a female needs to get both. Okay, so hemophilia is another characteristic that is sex-linked, and specifically it's called sex-linked recessive. Anybody, raise your hand if you know someone who has hemophilia. And if you say, I don't know what hemophilia is, then it's quite possible you don't. Okay, so I saw one, maybe two hands. So hemophilia is another sex-linked trait, but it's one where your blood doesn't clot like it should. So you get a cut, your blood clots, you stop bleeding. That's a good thing. If you have hemophilia, then your blood doesn't clot like it should. Now, sometimes people's blood doesn't clot like it should because they're on blood thinners. Because, like, medically, the blood thinner, is that cholesterol or blood pressure, Mr. DeBoer, that we typically go blood thinners for? Cholesterol, right? Yeah?
That would be cholesterol,
Okay.
yeah.
So sometimes people will take blood thinners, or some people will take, like, an aspirin a day, which thins your blood, to try to reduce the risk of heart disease. It's kind of this, it's similar from, like, if you get a cut, it doesn't stop bleeding as quickly. However, this is a genetic reason for it. It's pretty significant. I know someone who has hemophilia, and they actually have to have some medicine stored, and they have to keep it in their fridge, I'm pretty sure. That in the event that they get a cut, they have something to help them do the clotting process. So, I guess we'll finish talking about this tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.
Finish your talk right at
The fridge. Oops.